Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of the Scrutiny and Performance Committee of Perth and Kinross Council of Wednesday, the 29th of January 2025. I'm the convener, Councillor Colin Stewart. To my left is the Vice Convener, Bailey Alistair Bailey. We have the Clerk to the Committee, Kirsten Molly, and the Deputy Chief Executive, Claire Mailer, on the top table. Are there any apologies or substitutions, Clerk?
Thanks, Convener. We have no formal apologies this morning, and I think we just have one member joining us online. Can I please check if we have Councillor Frampton online? I think we do have her in the thing. And all other members.
Thank you. Item 2 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Councillor Shires, followed by Councillor Ford.
Thank you, Convener. It's just for transparency that I'm a member of the Tayside Contracts Joint Board.
What she said. Thank you. I don't think it's a formal declaration of interest because Tayside Contracts is a joint committee of the council, but thank you for the transparency around that. Item 3 on the agenda is the minutes. Can we first of all agree the minute of the Scrutiny and Performance Committee of 20th of November 2024? Thank you very much. And can we also agree the minute of the special meeting of the Scrutiny and Performance Committee of 18th of December 2024? Thank you very much. We'll go on to the outstanding business statement. The first item was that at the November meeting, we asked for Culture Perth and Kinross to circulate some research papers on the evidence of benefits of libraries, and that was completed. That was circulated to all members. And then on the next item is the Data Protection Compliance Report 2324, information to be shared on whether regulation of investigatory powers allows for a Scottish local authority to use covert cameras. And that will be done by the next meeting. We have on our agenda today an item in completion of item 48 on the outstanding business statement, and in terms of the call for topics, data on staff turnover and length of service was shared with members, so that item is also complete. Can we agree to remove the completed items from the outstanding business statement? Question from Councillor Forbes.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. We all got the data on staff turnover. What my concern that I expressed at the last meeting was about senior staff turnover, but the data we got is all staff, so I don't think that's quite what we were looking for. So I wonder if we could perhaps add that to a future item. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. It was, I think, HR that compiled that information, so we'll go back to them and we'll leave that item open to see whether a possible breakdown, a possible further breakdown is whether a further breakdown is possible. Thank you. Other than that, can we agree to remove all the completed items from the business statement? Thank you. Item 5 on the agenda is the Tayside Contracts Annual Performance Report for 23-24. That has been circulated with the papers for the meeting, and we have representatives of Tayside Contracts with us. I was going to say Chief Executive, but it's Managing Director is the formal title, Keith McNamara, and is it Dougie Mackay? Also here from Tayside Contracts. Keith, I believe you've got a presentation to introduce us to the report, so I'll just hand over without further delay to you.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, councillors. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to your committee our annual performance report, as the Convener says, for 2023-24. This was approved by the Tayside Contracts Joint Committee in November 24. As you point out, I'm joined today by Dougie Mackay, who's our Head of Operations. So Dougie has operational responsibility for our main operational activities, which is construction and facilities. I've just got a few slides to go through. Just wanted to highlight some of the key performance highs from our perspective, some of the main challenges we've experienced and indeed are still experiencing, and to counter the challenges, some key areas for action. So if we could just move to the first slide, please. So in terms of performance highs in the year concerned with the annual performance report, we generated a surplus of £1.06 million, which exceeded our £750,000 budget by 42%. We, working with council colleagues from all three councils, we have a joint action plan to improve meal numbers in schools, and we're very pleased to report that we've seen a 9.2% increase on average daily meal numbers, which really helps to support councils in their statutory duty to promote school meals. We increased our turnover by 7.5% to £89.4 million. So again, positive movements in terms of incoming work to the organisation. We've also generated savings, efficiencies and additional income of £1.67 million. The detail of that is in Appendix 2 of the report, and I'll talk about our actions, our transformational actions in our change fund later on. We're very proud to have supported over 60 groups with our community fund, which is basically community group has a need of a service that Tayside Contracts can provide. So it could be provision of meals to a community function, or some construction activities in, for example, car parks, etc. We do the work. The work is funded from our community fund, and across Tayside, in-kind funding has been provided to the tune of £100,000. And during that period, I think it was 20 local community groups in Perth and Kinross received the advantage of the community fund. I've got to say I'm immensely proud of the response from Tayside Contracts colleagues in response to the significant storm events of late 2023. Kind of brings it home slightly to us after the events of Friday, but it was a really intense time, some significant weather, as this committee is well aware, and our people were out in all weathers during red weather warnings to clear roads and footpaths, to unblock drains, etc., to open up emergency rest centres and deliver support there, and also provide a community meal service for vulnerable people. As I say, I'm so proud of the response that our people put out there. And last one is probably a bit more of a local Perth and Kinross one. Our quarry is based at Calais. And through extensive technical and detailed community engagement, we've secured planning approval for the extension of the quarry for the next 30 years. Now, I think that's very positive news for all three councils, because it delivers a security of supply of roadstone materials for all three councils into the future, as well as a significant income generator opportunity. Next slide, please. In terms of challenge, 23-24 was the year post-pandemic. Absolutely unprecedented levels of inflation. Costs rose by incredible amounts. Bitumen was up by 30%, energy was up by about 150%, food costs were up by about 45-50%. So I've just never seen price increases like that in my career. The high levels of inflation drove unprecedented levels of pay award. Tayside Contracts, 3/4 of our employees are on the lowest local authority grade. So when pay awards are awarded which have a differential, i.e. lower paid employees get a higher level of pay award in percentage terms, then that affects Tayside Contracts significantly more than the constituent councils. So that added another £2 million costs onto our pay bill. Sickness, absence and turnover and vacancies kind of deal with all three of these. This reflects national picture. Both organisations such as Improvement Service and the Chartered Institute for Personnel Development say that across Scotland and across the UK, sickness turnover vacancies is really challenging in the public sector. So our sickness absence didn't quite make our target, but it was an improvement by 0.1%, but still an improvement from previous years, and that shows some of the actions we're taking to improve sickness absence. Turnover is a real challenge, and I think that a big issue is in and around paying conditions, and that's something we're looking at. And also we have key vacancies in several posts, particularly in roads construction and street lighting, and that has been an ongoing challenge. And we've taken steps to reduce the vacancies as much as possible. I can go into that in detail if the committee so wishes. I mentioned previously about a response to the challenges of the storms. The response to the storms and the recovery and aftermath of the storms did affect our operational performance indicators because we had to prioritise dealing with the storms and the aftermath. That had an impact on our performance indicators, but also had an impact on our ability to pursue other commercial work again, because our people were prioritising supporting the communities in the response to the storms. Next slide, please. In terms of priorities, we absolutely recognise the financial challenges facing the councils. We have something called a change plan. It's probably, to use maybe other language, it's a transformation programme. As I alluded to earlier on, we've through the previous transformational activities we've carried out, we've managed to save just under £1.7 million. We're going through the next phase of the change plan, and we're putting a report to our joint committee in March of this year. As you can appreciate, as you make these savings and efficiencies, it becomes progressively harder to find other ones, but we are absolutely focused on doing that. We have in place a medium-term financial plan, and to offset what we are predicting is what we call the mid-range scenario of financial circumstances. We recognise we need to increase our commercial income by £2 million and increase our collaborative income, that is work that we do for the constituent councils, by £4 million. We have a recruitment strategy in place, and we're working through the actions around that one. And we also have implemented a wellbeing strategy and various actions to tackle sickness absence. A feature for Tayside contracts for me is transparency of performance. We currently have a working group with elected members from the Joint Committee to develop a performance dashboard, which would be available online for Joint Committee members and other elected members if they so wished, which would be a dynamic at a glance look at the key areas of our performance, and anybody can access that at any time. And we are still very much supportive of promoting community engagement, things like our employability activities with with each of the three councils, supporting vulnerable people into employment, and the community fund. And I had the pleasure just before Christmas of attending a Meet the Funder event just across the chamber there, which was very well represented to share the opportunities to community groups for the community fund. So last slide, please. In conclusion, I just want to relate something which appeared at our joint committee on Monday, that this was our annual accounts, which were slightly delayed in being presented to the joint committee due to issues with our external auditor had sickness absence issues, which meant we couldn't hit the allotted time. But I want to just summarise three things which the auditor said about Tayside contracts. Said Tayside contracts has appropriate and effective financial management arrangements in place. We have effective and appropriate arrangements in place to plan to use our resources to sustain delivery of services, and we have appropriate arrangements in place to ensure that resources are deployed to improve strategic outcomes that meet the need of service users. So I was very pleased and gratified by that independent assessment of Tayside contracts. Convener, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNamara. And before we move to questions, just to reflect that at the last meeting of the Scrutiny and Performance Committee, we were talking about the our sort of final wrap-up report on the severe weather events of October, December 23, and we passed on during the course of that review our thanks to the direct council staff, but obviously Tayside Contracts are involved in the roads maintenance partnerships. We'd like to put on record our thanks to the staff of Tayside Contracts for their response during those events as well. First questions are from Councillor Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask both my questions at the same time? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Keith, for your very good presentation. As always, good. You said that staff vacancies was an issue for you. Do you have as you know, this council has a slippage policy. Can you explain what the difference in staff vacancies and your slippage policy is?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Robertson. Yeah, vacancies are when a post, obviously somebody moves on and the post becomes vacant, and that post would sit. What organisations, I know Perth and Kinross Council has it, because I know from previous experience of working here, and Tayside Contracts have, is what you call a slippage. It's not, I wouldn't call it a policy. What we would say is we factor into the budget. So we know that when a post becomes vacant, there is a time lag until that post becomes filled. So it could be 2 or 3 months or something like that. During that period, obviously we're not paying an employee for that. In budgetary terms, we factor in the across a workforce of 3,300 posts in Tayside Contracts. That adds up to quite a bit. So across each of our different parts of our organisation, we will factor into our budget preparation. We think the budget, the staffing budget might be X, or we would deduct by a certain percentage, usually about 2, 3, 4, 5% from that figure. So the charge that we would charge the councils, we do have that small percentage figure deducted to take into account that gap between a vacancy being created and filling the post. Hopefully that answers your question.
One more, if I may. I was really encouraged to see the increase in the turnover of Tayside Contracts. Can you tell us what sort of cooperation is there between Tayside Contracts and other similar bodies in Scotland, like in Fife or in the surrounding areas? And if there are plans to increase that cooperation, and also to share things like human resources and other functions that you have as an organisation.
Thanks, Councillor Robertson. It's very difficult to actually share with other local authorities because Tayside Contracts is unique in Scotland and broadly unique in the UK. The only other organisation which I think is even remotely related to Tayside Contracts and activities and opportunities is the Ayrshire Roads Alliance, but that is just 2 local authorities and they only cover roads. So the scope and scale of their operation is nothing like the scale of Tayside Contracts. We certainly do have very close associations with other local authorities, not just our 3 constituent councils. So for example, we carried out extensive work during the period of which we're talking about for Fife, Stirling and Falkirk councils. So we do have very close associations with these local authorities, and we do work closely with them in areas such as civil contingency planning, etc. So we don't, there's not actually another Tayside Contracts organisation that we can share notes with, unfortunately. I wish there was. And in fact, one of the items on my agenda is to carry on promoting the Tayside Contracts shared service model, because I'm a very, very strong believer in it. And I think one of the ways we can deal with the significant financial challenges is through collaboration and shared services. So I'm very keen to promote that wherever I can.
Thank you very much. Next is Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Mr McNamara, for your presentation. Within your presentation, you spoke about those exorbitant inflationary pressures, which range from, in your experience, 30 to 150%, which obviously can't help when you're looking at trying to manage a budget in a business. In your recent experience, have you found that those pressures have relaxed Are they still high? Are they less? And how do you see that impacting on your company in the year ahead? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Allen. I'm very pleased to say that the pressures are significantly less. I mentioned food inflationary increases during 23-24, which was something like 45-50%. We're now budgeting food increases to be about 5%, and we think we might be slightly cautious around that one. So things have settled down, which is positive. However, the costs will never go back. So once you hit that ceiling of costs that we've had to bear, and indeed our councils have had to bear from these inflationary increases, that becomes the baseline, unfortunately. So although things going into the future are looking a lot more positive, general inflation between 2 and 3%, so that has a knock-on impact on everything else. So in terms of a risk to the organisation, it's far, far less of a risk than it was in 23-24.
Thanks. And as it's on a related theme, I might just interject here with a question. In your slide presentation, you were reporting the financial turnover increase of 7.5%. I just wondered how much of that was related to inflationary and wage pressures versus an increase in the actual amount of business or the commercial income or the income from the councils.
Thanks, Councillor Stewart. Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. There was a significant combination of increased cost of inflation, which we had to then pass on in charges to the councils, but we did also have significant increased workload, again, principally due to the response to the storms, the repair damage to storms, etc. So that had a big impact on our turnover. And we did also have significant increases in commercial income across the 2-year period. So things like, as I was mentioning earlier on, we had something like £600,000 of additional business from neighbouring local authorities. We're partnering with the National Trunk Road contractor again, so that's bringing in. We're providing working services for them, which again is bringing in 6 figures as well. So it's a combination of the 3 things, but I wouldn't escape the fact that the increase in turnover was a substantial part of that, was the inflationary increases.
Thank you. Councillor Forbes.
Thanks, Convener. Keith, one thing that's always frustrated me about the relationship, I think, between Tayside Contracts and the 3 constituent councils is the kind of odd variety of work that Tayside Contracts do for some. So I know, for example, that we'll do some gutter repairs for one organisation or one authority, but not for others. Could you maybe just explain how that works and if there's any detriment to Tayside Contracts from such confusion?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Forbes. You're absolutely right. There is not a consistent picture across the 3 councils in terms of their use of Tayside contract services. And I think you've already alluded to an example. If I give you a couple of other examples, for example, we provide a fleet management service for Angus Council, but we don't for Dundee City or Perth and Kinross. We provide community meal service for Dundee City and to a certain extent Angus Council. Conversely, we provide things like gutter cleaning services for Perth and Kinross Council, but we don't do for the other 2 councils. So we actually did an analysis of 40 different areas of services that we can provide that one council is using or 2 councils are using, but not the 3rd and not the 2nd. So we've been working through that with our governance and strategy group. Why that is, it's very difficult to pin down. It was a very interesting comment from the independent assessment of Tayside Contracts carried out in 2023, which suggested that councils do not regard Tayside Contracts as an affiliate organisation. The suggestion is that colleagues who maybe had quite a strong association with Tayside Contracts have moved on in terms of the churn and transition of people in posts. New people coming in maybe don't quite get the Tayside Contracts as effectively a department of the councils as a shared service. And we've been doing a lot of work recently promoting that message through the governance and strategy group of officers, but also having meetings with colleagues at different levels of their organisations to say, there is a minute of agreement. There is activities that Tayside Contracts can and should be providing for you. And also, if you do go out to tender, again, in a minute of agreement, which is a document co-signed by the 3 councils, if organisations are going out to tender for works which Tayside Contracts could do, we should be included in the tender. And I think there's just something been lost in translation over the years with that. So we're identifying that, and we're taking action to make sure that councils are fully aware of the services Tayside contracts provides and the obligations on councils to use Tayside contracts. And equally important, where councils aren't using Tayside contracts, we want to know why, because it could be something to do with us, and if we're not delivering best value, we'd want to know why we're not, so that we can improve as well. So it's not just putting all the onus onto councils. We want to know if there's issues with Tayside contracts. So I think we've identified the issue, we're dealing with it, and I've got to be honest, the response from council colleagues is very positive towards that. So we've had a lot of engagement with procurement colleagues who are obviously key in that, but also operational colleagues, and we've already seen ourselves pick up additional work from that, because councils are now recognising who we are and what we do.
Thank you. And I think you wanted to come in on this point, Deputy Chief Executive.
Thank you, Convener. And I think, Keith, you probably sort of concluded there by giving an overview. I think just to give assurance to committee, exactly as Keith said, we've collectively looked at the mapping exercise to have a look at all of the activity, where it's undertaken in terms of the local authorities. We've had a really good joint meeting with Keith's management team just prior to Christmas, and our strategic leads and service managers across the organisation are looking at all of the activity and services provided by Tayside contracts, looking at the efficiency and the cost of them, where we're procuring that work from, and where there are opportunities for us to sort of work more collaboratively across the Tayside contracts model. So that work's underway, and it's quite an interesting sort of mapping exercise that Tayside contracts have undertaken to support us in that work.
Councillor Massey.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for talking us through the annual performance report. During the slides, it said about the increased collaborative income from the three councils by £4 million. Now, is this an increase in costs of services that you are already providing, or is it for new services?
Thanks, Councillor Massey. It really relates to the previous question and answer. It is services which Tayside contracts currently provide that are going elsewhere for. And I'll give you a couple of illustrations. We have a sign shop. So if a council is going to get their signage needs from somewhere else, that seems possibly a bit inappropriate, because the councils are co-owners of a sign shop, and then council services are going and using another, say, a private contractor. So what we're looking for in terms of targeting at that £4 million are services which the Tayside contracts currently provides, that councils are currently going elsewhere for. When we did the mapping analysis that I referred to in the previous question, the total value, if all councils were to use all Tayside contracts services to the same extent, the value of that would be £10 million. So we think £4 million is a fair number to be looking to achieve.
Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Convener, and thank you, Mr. McNara, for, I think, a very positive demonstration or slide. Really. My question actually is on the school crossings. Is it a couple of parts here? If there is an existing person there and there is a zebra crossing or a pellet crossing, if the person retires, does that mean that there won't be filled that position? And are you having difficulty filling the positions? And I find that quite strange, in the sense there's a lot of people of my generation who have got lots of time that could maybe be employed. And is there a struggle to get people to do the job?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Smith. There are moments when, sorry, I'll answer the first part of your question first, because it's probably easier for Tayside contracts. The decision whether to replace a school crossing patroller if there's been some sort of traffic control introduced is with Perth and Kinross Council, not with Tayside contracts. We have, to answer the second part of your question, we have had issues in the past with recruiting into school crossing patrollers. Currently, the situation in Perth and Kinross is actually quite healthy. There are 3 vacancies at the moment. One of them is exactly the scenario you're portraying, where a crossing has been put in and PKC are considering whether they want to have that post replaced. The other 2, I think, have been vacant for about three months. So that's not unusual, but I think the situation in Perth and Kinross is a lot more positive than it was, I think, when I was here this time last year.
Vice Convener.
Thank you very much, Convener. My question is related to customers of Tayside contracts beyond the 3 constituent councils. So it's good to hear that on the roads and the capital work, there's been the work done with those Central Belt councils and Stirling, plus the collaboration with Amy is fantastic as well. Where I'm going with this, though, is about the Tay Cuisines facility. When in this chamber we agreed collectively to move our education, our school meals across to Tay Cuisines. One of the promises was made was we were sold on the broader economies of scale to the public sector that comes from having this facility, and the Tayside contracts would, if PKC came in, have a better base on which to then attract more public sector and maybe private customers. Can you tell us anything about whether you have secured any work for the Tay Cuisines kitchen beyond the constituent councils and maybe in the private sector, or if not, what efforts are still ongoing? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bailey. Yeah. At this stage, we have secured some additional work through community meals in Angus Council area. We have not achieved another council to provide the service to another council for the full meal service. That has not been helped by the Scottish Government's decision to move back the provision of universal free school meals. That was going to be one of the drivers for other councils to perhaps consider Tayside contracts. By moving to universal free school meals, it requires much greater capacity within the schools, because that's not such an urgent issue now. That's not been such a major consideration for councils. We have given prices, and we have engaged with 2 councils. We've given them prices. One of them has come back to say they don't want to go down the line with ourselves. We're seeking feedback on why that is. Another one's still considering. We're also engaging with 2 other councils who were looking to have visit us very shortly to again promote the service and offer a price at which we would like to think they would find that attractive. But they do seem very keen at this stage. It is a bit of a slow burn, and it's slower than I would have wanted, but we go at the pace of the purchasing councils.
Councillor Shard.
Thank you, Convener. Mr McNamara, my questions around the challenges that we discussed extensively at the Joint Committee about recruitment. And I know in the annual report talks about work being done attending school career events and working with education services across the 3 councils. And it was around, I would have thought that Tayside contracts would be quite attractive as an opportunity for young people, you know, leaving school and looking for a career. So obviously there's something not going as we would like. And do we offer incentives, apprenticeships, working with the colleges, that kind of thing, just to try and see that it could be a career path that would then be a long-term option for young people?
Yeah, absolutely, Councillor Shires. I was probably not as specific as I should have been when I was highlighting that as an issue. The issue that we have with vacancies as in key posts. So, for example, in facilities, by and large, there's not a major issue with vacancies. The vacancies which we have are long-term vacancies which are difficult to shift, are in largely more technical posts. I totally agree with you. I think Tayside contracts is a type of organisation we can offer a very wide variety of posts to, such as entry-level posts which are term time, relatively limited hours for people with childcare issues, right up to really very significant technical professional roles. I think the work that we've done through things like job academies, working with the schools, working with employability teams, has been beneficial in terms of filling the posts that we have in facilities. Your point's well made around things like apprentices, because again, mechanics is an area which all councils struggle with. So we've got a very extensive apprentice programme for our mechanics. I think we've had about 10 through the books recently. I think we've had about 22 road worker apprentices through since 2017. So that's an area we're investing in. We're also looking at things like bringing in people who may not have a qualification such as an HGV driver's qualification and letting them learn on the job and go through the qualification on the job. So we are taking steps around that one. Some of them are a bit more challenging in terms of things like street lighting partnership. I don't know if Mr Mackay has anything to add in terms of other things that we're doing to attract those really difficult to fill posts.
Thanks, Keith. I think in addition to those, so for example, with the street lighting, we've not actually been able to secure an apprenticeship scheme because the apprenticeship scheme has traditionally been based on the full electrical apprenticeship, but we have managed to identify through engagement with a couple of the local colleges that we will be able to go through that. And for example, this summer we're looking to actually recruit into an electrical apprenticeship for the first time. So, you know, these are all the areas, and I think we've been proactively working with colleges, Perth UHI. We've looked at if there's parts that they can assist us with, along with Dundee and Angus College, because we do currently have to go further afield to get the skills and the experience down at Edinburgh College. So it's if you want to say a focus for us within Tayside contracts through both parts of the service delivery, both the facility services and construction, is about growing our own if we can. So we're also encouraging those who maybe are coming at that entry level, such as Keith has made reference to see if they have the desire to progress and what we need to do that to actually be able to fill some of these gaps as well. So a combination of apprenticeships, bringing in skilled, but very much if we can grow our own is something that we see that we need to do. And the turnaround for things like schools, it's something that we've not engaged with probably as actively as we could, and it's getting in. We see that being as an early stage in primary schools, letting people know what Tayside contracts do, and hopefully continue with that journey through their schooling. So not just at primary, secondary. It's a bit of an ambition, but we have sort of mapped out, you know, if we could affiliate with maybe some schools within each of the areas and, you know, provide work opportunities that can maybe then lead into sort of internships. That's very much a sort of a longer term sort of plan and philosophy that we see would be very beneficial across the three council areas to work to.
Thank you. I see you've put a second question in. Is it related? No. Okay, we'll move on and we'll give Councillor Welch his first question.
Thank you, Convener. It follows on from Bailey in terms of Tay Cuisine's Kitchen. In terms of the available capacity that facility has, and currently its capacity in terms of usage, what headroom do you have? Is it, for example, operating at 50% capability, and what expansion opportunities are there? And reading in the press, I understand that the forthcoming Scottish Government settlement will provide potentially additional school meal opportunities for S1 to S3 pupils in certain circumstances. I'm wondering if you have got some early insight into how you will fulfil that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Councillor Welsh. Yes, in relation to Tay Cuisine, the expansion opportunities, we currently do something in the region of 5.5 million meals per year. If you use that facility to its absolute massive extent, 24 hours, 7 days a week, I think it would be a capacity of about 18 to 20 million meals. It's probably not something we'd want to go with, so I'd probably say we've got at least double the capacity that we've got at the moment as an opportunity. In terms of the settlement for S1s to S3s, that's very positive news. It's not something we've acted on as yet, so I've made a note for myself to research that when we go to the chamber.
Thank you.
Councillor Shars, we'll come back to you now. Thank
you. My second question was around the sort of wider communication that Tayside contracts do, and I noticed there's a section in the annual report, and Convener always talks about the format of the reports. I actually found this format really readable and easy to follow. So thank you for that, because sometimes we get a bit lost in the narrative of it all. And it was around the communication, the social media work that I know has been a real focus for Tayside contracts and has improved quite dramatically. And I noticed there's quite a lot of comment in here, customers of parents and other customers of Tayside contracts. It was just to get an understanding about how that's going to develop in the future, making sure that it's relevant and up to date.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Shires. Yeah, I think we have made significant leaps in terms of the communications, and I think part of the success of the meal uptake numbers has been because of the communications now, whether it's be through social media, through newsletters which we issue, and are seem to be very well received by parents. I think it is just a question of keep on doing the same as we're doing, look for other opportunities, because social media develops so quickly as an entity that we need to kind of keep on the back of that as we're going. But it's probably an area which I'm not concerned with in terms of what we're doing just now, and I think we just keep doing the way we're doing. But if there's any other suggestions of any other areas we'd want to be honing in on, then I'd be grateful for a conversation about that.
Thank you. Councillor Allen, another question.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you again. I'm going to come back to a question that was asked by my colleague, Councillor Smith, earlier on about school crossing patrol people. I asked recently about what I thought was a vacancy in my own ward, which is the Strathallan ward, and I was told that the vacancy had been absorbed within the budget and is no longer available. So my question really is there a conversation that we can have about reintroducing school patrol people, or is that something that has to happen within the council first and foremost? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Allen. Yeah, that is a decision I would suggest for Perth and Kinross Council.
Thank you. And Councillor Welch.
Sorry, I was a bit unsettled by that last question, but moving on. My specific question is just around, and it's probably for Mr McNamara and for officers of PKC, is in terms of utilising additional capacity where potentially some services, and you cited the example of signs. How do we benchmark for best value and ultimately procure in that environment, so that ultimately that capacity, which I agree should be beneficial because of the nature of the structure of Tayside contracts, how do we sort of say fulfil our procurement and best value benchmarking? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Welsh. Yes, in terms of benchmarking, Tayside Contracts is a member of APSI, the Association of Public Service Excellence. It's a national UK-wide organisation where we go through considerable benchmarking with local authority organisations across the UK. In terms of more localised benchmarking, we've just going through our budget setting process, and part of that is our pricing. So, for example, if I take our quarry as an illustration, when we look at pricing and comparisons, we would benchmark against what other providers are providing, because we don't want to set a price which would price us out the market. Equally, we don't want to price on something so low that we're not making enough of a margin to cover our costs. So it's a combination of the two things. It's really through local authority benchmarking, but also local benchmarking against other providers in the area for specific services.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Councillor Welsh.
So thank you for that. Is there any sort of comment, in terms of how we approach that process to, for example, look to see whether we can, get additional efficiencies, as Perth and Kinross Council within the Tayside contract framework? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Keith's given you the overview there, but certainly from a Perth and Kinross point of view, and the exercise that we talked about earlier in terms of where there are opportunities for further work, signage is one point. And actually the discussion that we did have with the management team was very much, if we are actually finding that our existing supplier provides a kind of more favourable price, then we will continue with that and indeed do further benchmarking to see where we get the best price point. And that was kind of absolutely acknowledged round the table with senior managers. So that was one conversation. So just be assured from Parthen Ross' point of view, for us, we continue to seek best value and the most sort of cost effective sort of delivery of service.
Thank you. That's helpful, because ultimately that should work both ways. It should be able to challenge, Tayside contracts to provide a market related price as well, and in that collaborative fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any further questions in the chat, but maybe just on a sort of related topic to that last follow up from Councillor Welch. Does all of the work that is contracted from Tayside contracts by the constituent councils, is that all done by Tayside contract staff, or do you subcontract any of that out?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Yeah, there is an element of contracting some things out. Now, that could be a circumstance where, as part of a job, there's something which is a bit specialist that we would not provide that service, so we would subcontract in the specialist contractor. Similarly, if we have a situation where we have multiple jobs on and we need to commit to supporting a council. So say, for example, a council sometimes gets Scottish Government or other external funding, sometimes at the last minute, and the money's to be spent by the end of the financial year. In terms of our programme of works, we would bring on engage a subcontractor to support that type of work. By and large, we do the majority of the work ourselves, but when we need to, under these types of circumstances, we do use subcontractors.
Doesn't that just lead to an additional overhead, if you like, to the councils, because us contracting you and then you contracting somebody else will have greater costs associated with it than if we contracted directly with whoever you contracted with, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I know Mr Mackay might want to comment on that, but what I would say is we also need to consider the peaks and troughs of demand. If all councils had the same money to spend every single year at exactly the same time, it'd be very easy for us to programme a workforce that would be able to deliver that. But things change so variably over the year, it's very difficult to have that workforce that can just flick the switch to respond to a demand, especially when council customers are coming to us and saying, can you get that job done by the 31st of March? If I may, Convener, maybe invite Mr Mackay to say something.
What I would say, there's other factors to consider over above that, as in how it is procured. So we have a supply chain network, so to be able to deliver, if you want to say, the works, we engage with local supply chain to make sure we can deal with that. So we've went through all the, if you want to say, the checks and balances in advance to say, they've got the competency, they've got that, and in effect how we procure that. If you were separating it out from each of the councils and they said, can you not do these works, that would then lie with, if you want to say, each council to be able to do that. Then you've got to make sure you've got the resources in place to manage that. So we also then have, if you want to say that, the expertise of managing these particular subcontractors. That's not established necessarily within each of the councils, so it's not as clear cut as going if you were to go direct, because they may not, right? You could, just because they provide a price to Tayside contracts, that may not be the same price that would come back to each of the councils, because how they approach their business risk, etc. We know that a lot of subcontractors actually prefer to go, if you want to say, through a management contractor or more of a principal contractor, and actually undertaking the works directly for either a private entity or possibly a council.
Thank you very much. One last call for questions, if there are any. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. We'll move to comments, and we've got a comment from the Vice Convener.
Thank you, Convener. I was listening intently to the lines of questioning about school crossing patrollers. Just feel compelled to do a sort of a bit of an advert for school crossing patrollers. We all have schools in our ward, especially primary schools, where there's traffic problems, and we'll all be on to officers about how do we solve those traffic problems. And I think the school crossing patrollers are a large part of that because they give parents the confidence to send their kids walking along to school. I also observe, and I've bored people with this before, that with the idea of replacing school crossing patrollers with pelican or zebra crossings, I think it's a no-goer because of the fact that drivers as adults all have to pass a professional qualification to prove they know how to use that crossing, whereas school kids don't. And I think that's part of the value of it. So, and I suppose also just to give people the reassurance that in my experience, any reduction in school crossing patrollers has always come through this chamber and been approved by either full council or on one occasion the Learning and Families or its predecessor Lifelong Learning Committee. So it's always within our hands if we're reducing school crossing patrollers, rest assured. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Forbes.
Thanks, Convener. Just a couple of brief comments, if you may allow. I was reassured to hear from both Claire and Keith that the frustration I've had about the relationship between the three councils and Tayside contracts has already been looked at senior level. I don't know if it's worth perhaps putting that on the outstanding business statement or recording it in the minutes in some way so we can keep an eye on that and keep some pressure to get that done. Delighted to see the increase in school meal numbers. I remember a few years ago the horror and outrage at the prospect of using frozen meals and moving to take cuisine. So I'm delighted to see that one of the outcomes of that is actually an increase in the take-up rate of school meal numbers. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll record the point in the minute. I think we might not add it to the outstanding business statement, given that we're not going to get Tayside contracts back, I would imagine, until the next annual performance report. But we can certainly bring it up at or get regular updates from the senior management team or executive leadership team here at Perth and Kinross Council on that. Not seeing any further requests for comment. I think I would like to just echo what Councillor Shires said about the readability of the report, and I think what was especially nicely laid out. You talked in your opening presentation about the 1.67 million of efficiency savings that had been achieved in the appendix at the end that lays that out very nicely for us. So thank you for that. If there are no further comments, thank you very much, Mr. McNamara, Mr. Mackay, for attending and for answering, for providing the annual performance report and the presentation and the answers to the members' questions. Thank you very much. We'll now just take a break for 2 minutes, I think, just to allow movement around the chamber for people who are answering questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. We now move on to item 6 on the agenda, which is the review of inclusion practice in school, and Vice Convener Bailey Bailey will lead the discussion on this item on the agenda.
Thank you. So the item is the update on the scrutiny review for the review of inclusive practice in schools. And in turn, I'd like to hand to David McCluskey, who's going to give a brief introduction and introduce his team. Thank you.
Many thanks, Bailey. So at the last Scrutiny Performance Committee, a scope for the review of inclusive practice was agreed, and it posed 3 questions related to the adjustments that were made to support children and young people with additional support needs, and how these adjustments were applied over time, including and especially at key transition points. Councillors on the committee have already had an opportunity to meet with staff, partners and parents to gather information and develop a growing understanding of the practice that's happening in our schools. Today's presentation and the report by Education and Learning circulated with papers presents further information and outlines some key improvement areas to be considered by the committee as part of its review findings. Fiona Mackay, Service Manager Inclusion, and Susie Turner, Principal Educational Psychologist, are going to take us through a short presentation. And after that, they and other officers will be available to support and answering questions. Thank you.
Green.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for having us along and having given us the opportunity as Education and Learning to provide our perspective in terms of the response to the scope and the topic that has been chosen. We've tried, because it is such a wide ranging area, inclusive practice, even if when you narrow it down to this topic area, we've tried to provide a good range of examples or background that helps to support the committee in terms of their review of what has been happening. But we do appreciate that there will be probably a number of questions in relation to that, and we're supported today by Jen McNichol, Sarah Stephen, who are our Inclusion Quality Improvement Officers and have regular contact with schools, parents and children and young people, so can bring some life to some of your questions, and by Jacqueline Meikle, who's the ASN Transformation Programme Manager. All of the officers have provided some support during their visits to schools and to other meetings. We've also, because inclusive practice is so embedded in the legislation, we're also supported by our legal section, and we're grateful that Sarah Rogers is also here today, who often is our advice and guidance around many of our trickier areas. But I'm going to hand over to Susie first to do some of the slides.
Thank you, Fiona. And if we could move to the next slide, and it does start with our legal duties, which guide all of our policy work and our frameworks. And I'd like to start with the bottom section, which is the presumption of mainstream from the Standards in Scotland Schools Act 2000. And that says that all children with additional support needs have a right to be educated in their local mainstream school, and that really only those with additional support needs that are at an exceptional level should be considered for specialist education. So that's very much our starting point. We always look to the local mainstream school and to adjustments that can be made from there. In 2004 and then amended in 2009, and since then is the additional support for learning legislation in Scotland. It comes with a code of practice that guides aspects such as the identification of needs and transition, and has guided our work. Quite recently, there have been a number, and if we can move to the next slide, of reviews. And that in part is in recognition of the rising levels of need and indeed rising complexity. In 2000, Angela Morgan was commissioned by Scottish Government to do an independent review. The review was completed before the pandemic. The report was published in May. And that was really quite a thorough review involving all stakeholders and well triangulated. And she was very clear that inclusive practice needed to be much more embedded, not just within education systems, but within the wider system of public service. And an additional quote from that report: education authorities have lead implementation responsibility, and yet the language of the legislation is learning for life. This encompasses a much wider perspective than education alone. However, that breadth of vision is not yet realised. Other agencies are not playing as full a role as intended by the legislation, not least due to increased thresholds for services due to austerity. And that places it, I think, back in 2020. In 2023, we had the publication of some research commissioned following the Doran report in 2012. The Doran review and report was focused on meeting children's needs who have complex and profound needs, and looking at how we do that across the nation. There was a sample of schools from a sample of local authorities, and there were similar themes to the Angela Morgan report. And that research talks about a perception of reduced resources, and again, within the context of rising need. And then in 2024, an ASL parliamentary inquiry looking again at the practice of the legislation and particularly some of the mechanics of the legislation, noting challenges around resourcing, around the physical building of our schools, around how placements are decided and legislation used, and recommends that local authorities review their own provisions to see if there are indeed any gaps in specialist provision. Thank you. The next slide, thanks. It's important, I think, that the work that we do, especially given that national context, is driven by evidence-based practice around inclusion, and broadly when it comes to successful outcomes, so successful experiences as well as good attainment and achievement for children with additional support needs. We know that the factors that make a difference largely focus upon the ethos of the school. So the extent to which our children and young people feel truly part of something, that they have something to contribute, that they're alongside, and that they have good relationships both with their peers and with their the staff around them. And that is very much dependent upon leadership, not just about knowledge of inclusion, but seeing the catchment of a school as very much all equal, all of our children. It also comes down, unsurprisingly, to good quality learning and teaching. But we have to recognise that some of our teaching staff and additional staff are meeting needs now that they weren't necessarily trained for. So we have a really strong focus on really good quality professional learning. And of course, evidence-based programmes to meet needs, and that really relies on really effective partnerships and good communication. So this is what we've drawn up from our experience and from that evidence base. Thank you. So if that's what we're aiming for, our current context, and this is where we see the changes in additional support needs over time. And that first graph there, you see the blue line is PKC and the orange graph is the national picture. It can probably be said that we were above the national picture for quite some time, and it's likely that some of that had something to do with a system whereby there was a bit of a tie-in with the allocation of resources. So motivation within schools to keep their recording of additional support needs up to date, but we are now very much mirroring the national picture, and a significant rise over the last 11 years, and particularly over the last couple of years. And that has meant that there are now 2,000 more children and young people with recorded additional support needs in 2024 versus 2013. And you'll see a greater prevalence of additional support needs in the secondary sector. That's about accumulated assessment over time, along with meeting increased demands through the curriculum. So that really tells us that we have to look at all of our approaches and our resourcing. Thank you. And what does that current need look like? So schools identify needs and input that through the CMIS system, and there's then an annual collation of that nationally, which is where we get the national picture from. But in terms of that number of the type of need, this slide gives the increases between 23 and 24. These increases mirror what we've seen previously. So where we see increases in mental health and autistic spectrum disorder between 23 and 24, that is a trend that we have seen in previous years. Children and young people can be recorded with more than one additional support need, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And it does lead to other difficulties being recorded, such as being at risk of exclusion. I think what is quite important to note on this side is that our data is matched by health data. So we have seen a rise in the number of children entering schools who are not meeting their developmental milestones, which is a screening done by health partners. And we've also seen a rise in our partnership work for 0 to 3-year-olds and with levels of complex needs. Thank you. If we can go on to the next slide. I've mentioned that children and young people can be recorded as having more than one additional support needs. And it's really important that within the inclusion team, we're really careful on the analysis of the data and we really understand what is happening and what that means, because there are some additional support needs and the definition is really wide. There are some additional support needs that can be relatively easily met at a classroom level. So we took two examples, English as an additional language and dyslexia, and they can be met, for example, by a class teacher, dyslexia, adapting the font that they're using, adapting the technology that they're using by the child using additional technology. EAL, that might mean the provision of additional vocabulary before some project work teaching, for example. So what these slides show is that the majority of our children and young people with either dyslexia or EAL do not have additional other needs, so that they can be met at a relatively low level. But if we go on to the next slide, please, what we will see is that in the case of autistic spectrum disorder, actually these needs are accompanied by other factors. So there is a rise in what's called comorbidity with ADHD, but there may also be associated difficulties that we understand, such as with anxiety, or indeed with particular ABLE needs, which also need adjustment within the classroom. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this slide, we talked about there being increased identification at secondary, but in this slide you can see that it's actually at primary. So it's in the earlier years where we are seeing that more comorbidity, the more of having a condition such as autism, but with associated other difficulties. And so while we've got the general rise in additional support needs, we've also got that rising complexity of need. And one of the questions, thank you if we can go on, that came up as part of our scrutiny review discussions was about the evidence base for that. Why is it that we're seeing the rise in additional support needs? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there has been a recent collation of trying to answer exactly that question. The evidence lies in different places. We know that there can be an impact on how systems work, and I mentioned our own Perth and Kinross system. The legislation has been in place for over 20 years, and that brings with it a growing awareness and reduced stigma, and that all leads obviously to increases in identification. But we've also seen a significant rise, all 4 nations within the UK, in the diagnosis, which is ultimately done by health professionals, of autism. And there are questions then within that about why is that? There was a broadening of the health-based criteria for diagnosis in 2015, and it's felt, again, rising awareness, reduced stigma. But there are others who believe that we've probably also got increased prevalence, not just increased diagnosis. That's quite hard to prove. And then the reasons for that at this moment in time remain hypothetical and could be about environment or genes. At the same time, of course, advances in medicine and year-on-year increases in premature births. And premature births are before 37 weeks. And I think it's really important that we're clear that children can be born prematurely and be absolutely fine, but the earlier they are born, the increased likelihood of associated difficulties, and when they're born really early, an association with aspects such as cerebral palsy and blindness. So that's a bit of an overview of our current context, and I'm going to pass back to Fiona now to explain how we organise ourselves around that.
The next slide, please. So in response to all that we have talked about already, we have a a policy framework that supports our schools and our teams to be able to deliver, and that's our staged intervention framework. And we organise our staged intervention framework around a pyramid, predominantly because the number of children that will be requiring support at the more complex needs is much smaller than that the number that are requiring it at a universal level. So we see progressively as we move through the tiers of support and assessment and planning that it becomes much more compact and manageable. But the framework is based on the staged intervention framework, but within that we also host an ASN framework for assessment and for planning. So we've reviewed our child and young person's plans and the guidance that sits with that to ensure that we are providing our schools with the best possible opportunity to be able to support the planning and adjustments that require to support our children to get the most out of their education. If we could move to the next slide. And the reason why a policy framework is so important is because we have got such a large population of children and young people to support. So we have almost 18,000 children in our schools overall, but we have almost 7,000 of those children with an additional support need recorded at in some way. Now, many of those, as Susie has said earlier, will be supported at a universal level, so may only have one recorded additional support need, or potentially even when they have additional needs, then they can still be supported within the classroom and by the classroom teacher and through classroom planning. But we do have a large workforce that we need to support to be able to do that. So we have the equivalent of 1,400 full-time teachers, but so some of them, there will be more staff than that, so that's 14,000 in terms of FTE, but the number of actual teachers will be greater than that, taking into account the number that will have perhaps part-time contracts. We also have 350 support staff across the piece that support these children and young people. So Susie had mentioned there, so we've obviously got quite a big focus in terms of support and planning, support and training for our staff because of the changing needs, but also to bring them up to speed with all of the developments that have come over recent years in terms of support for additional support needs. That takes some time, and we've increasingly used our in-service days to be able to target support. Our pupil support assistants for the last 3 years have had a dedicated day in November that brings them all together in one place to provide opportunities, both not just for networking for them, but also to access a number of workshops that help to support them to build knowledge and skills in terms of the responses to children and young people. And there are a number of other ways we offer twilight training, etc., as appropriate to the courses that are of interest. We could move to the next slide. So that brings us on to the challenge in terms of applying adjustments, which is the focus of the committee's review. And what we have here is the first graph with the orange and blue is a breakdown of the work of one of our teams, one of our peripatetic teams, our outreach teachers who provide support for across our primary schools. What we can see is in the blue columns are the inputs or the interventions that they provide that are set at an additional level, and you'll see that there is a large number of them and a smaller number of those that are at enhanced support level, so level 3 with the orange columns. Although the orange columns are smaller, they can often be more time consuming in many ways because they are an enhanced level of support. So it will be quite dedicated interventions that are there. What in the box on the bottom right hand corner, there is a hyperlink which is to examples of our staged intervention, stage levels of intervention. It's a document that's been put together to support parents to be able to understand what it looks like at different levels for their children if they're being advised in a school that we may be needing to have a child's plan to be able to look at whether additional support is required. We're going to make this document available on the PKC website so that it's publicly available and people can see it. But when you receive the slides, you'll be able to click into it yourself. It's probably too complicated. It would have been okay if I was doing it from here, but I think it's too complicated to ask officers to take us through that just now. But that has examples of what would be typically used within a classroom to be able to respond to the levels of need that are out there. And the small graph above that is purely around our primary 1 children who require enhanced levels of support, because what we have seen over the last 3 years is a growing number of children who require really tailored support at that level to be able to remain in their mainstream school and be able to access education and learning. And the numbers over time have increased, and I think that has become partly through seeing the complex needs rise, but also I think that an awareness by schools about the opportunities that we have to be able to support children to actually remain in a mainstream setting. If we could move on to the next slide. So the review has been really welcomed by Education and Learning because it's helped us in terms of support some of the improvement work that we're currently doing as part of the ESN transformation programme, and it's allowed us to reflect perhaps on areas that we may not have seen if we hadn't been looking at it with yourselves with this particular focus, but also to identify some of the strengths that I think that are there within our schools, but perhaps until you focus in on something, you don't stop and think what is it that we would say is good practice and strengths that we are seeing within our schools. So certainly the communication between schools to ensure that our children and young people, the appropriate information around the supports that they require is transmitted across our transformation points, whether that's from early learning and childcare settings into primary 1 or whether it's from primary 7 into S1. I think what hopefully people have seen when they've been out as well is that we have examples of some really good communication and support there. We also have a quite well developed approach now to supporting children and young people who require enhanced support to access that between primary 7 and S1, including the provision of summer holiday activities so that those children who require it don't lose the contact and focus over that 6 to 7 week period in the summer. We have certainly seen and heard from head teachers and hopefully from parents that there are many of the relationships that are between staff within schools and parents and children and young people are very supportive, and there are good relationships often within those settings and close support arrangements. We're working. We do have staff that have a good understanding of needs, and it is an area that we are continuing to work on and develop as we are seeing the changes in complexity. We have a good team of staff who are able to bridge that move between primary 6 and primary 7, primary 6, 7 and S1, S2. So we have a number of peripatetic teams and staff that are able to support that time. Some of our teams work across the full age range anyway, like the hearing impairment, visual impairment team, or the English as an additional language team, and our community learning assistants and community link workers. All of those staff can can form good supportive relationships that they're able to maintain across that transition points. We have good, certainly schools themselves often have very good links with parents and can provide a lot of support. We have now established a ASN parent network, which is looking at that from a more central point, where we're not looking at the individual cases of or situations of parents and children, young people, but looking at how do we engage with the body of parents of children with additional support needs as a whole, so that they can become more involved and inform developments that we've got ongoing. And finally, it's that the bit I think that what we have are able to evidence is that bit that we stick with adjustments or provisions of support over time. I think we're very clear that what our children and young people need is consistency, and consistency in terms of delivery. And if we were to just provide short inputs around for those with more complex needs, if we're to provide short inputs that we then would move on from, and support the support would change to something different, would be quite disruptive. But what we have looked at is maintaining that levels of support over time. And the final slide is just around what we are identifying as areas for improvement as a result of our involvement with you in terms of this review. The table aligns what we are finding in terms of the work that's also ongoing with the ASN transformation programme, because I think it's important that we build a consistency in terms of what we take forward. The important bit around policy is to improve the consistency of implementation of policy, and we recognise that with that large number of staff, with the large number of schools and large number of children and young people out there, there can be variation. And I think that our focus needs to be on reducing that variation and improving consistency in terms of delivery for all. In terms of people, I think our focus needs to be around staff absence and that mitigation of the impact that sometimes that can have. We can't avoid all staff absence, but we would want to be reducing levels if wherever possible, and working towards ensuring that we've got a system that means that our children don't fall through the gaps should that be happening. We're looking to support our parents to have greater communication with us, have greater involvement in child's plans, greater involvement in the assessment itself, and that is all supported by the policy framework that I spoke about earlier. The implementation of the UNCRC has also given us an opportunity to really focus in on how do we ensure that our children and young people themselves are as involved and engaged in their planning process as possible, so that they are very much at the forefront of helping us to shape appropriate plans. And are looking at our mainstream and learning environments, and I think that that's a kind of comment. Certainly Susie had mentioned it from some of our from one of the national reviews, but I think also people while out and about have heard that the need for us to focus in on our learning environments to support them to be as inclusive as possible is a real priority for us, and certainly sits within our place work stream of the ASN transformation. The second batch of improvements are around our staff skills and knowledge, particularly around the more complex needs end of the spectrum or the pyramid. Enhancing our transitions, we recognise that can be variable. We know that from the information that we've gathered for the committee. But what we are looking to do is, where we have that good practice that I spoke about earlier, it's about ensuring that becomes shared and embedded across all of our schools to take it forward. And enhancing so in terms of the place model, enhancing our specialist learning environments. And we have a report coming to the Learning and Families Committee later on today to look at how we can extend the availability of our intensive support provisions for children and young people who need a very specialist level of education because they're unable to benefit from a mainstream education. So there is work that is ongoing within some of these areas already, but also certainly lots more to do. We're happy to take any questions if there is anything further.
Great, thank you very much for the presentation. So I'll open up to questions then. So Councillor Allen, if you're going to go ahead with your clarity point and your questions, let's take them all at once. Yep.
Thank you, Vice Convener, and thanks to Fiona and Susie too. Comprehensive in the presentation. I've got a clarity point. Can I go back to the slide where it's talking about primary one? I think it was about the fourth slide back. I can ask the question. At the end of the day, the slides came up and it talked about there was numbers on 3 different years. And my question really trying to understand, I didn't get it from the graph, and maybe it was there. Were those numbers as in 12 pupils for Perth and Kinross, or was it 12% and the 20 and the 39? I'm trying to understand whether it was number of pupils or percentages.
It was the number of pupils. So the provision of enhanced support is quite a specific project that requires quite a lot of resource. So it was the number of pupils that were there that are receiving enhanced support. So in primary one, so 12 in 2023, 22 this current year, and we're anticipating 35 based on the assessment information that's come forward so far from our early learning and childcare settings.
So thank you for that. My first question really is a bit of a point and then a question. I've been involved in this review, and I've got to say it's been quite an eye-opener. It's been quite disturbing as well. Within your numbers there, you suggested that we've got about 40% of people who within our younger community require additional support needs. And in 1 or 2 of our schooling performances, that can be as high as 67%. Now, we had a discussion previously, and there was a suggestion that at some stage in the future, it's going to be 100%, and ASN will become the norm. And I'm just going to ask the question now, have we not already met that red line? If we've got 67% of pupils with additional support needs, we've got 33% of pupils who are not getting a full commitment from that teacher because their attentions are elsewhere. And therefore, we are maybe not allowing people to develop and excel as they possibly would do in another situation. It'd just be good to get some comments on that. Thank you.
Yes, happy to. It's quite a wide range of questions. I might not capture all of it at the one go, so happy to come back. I suppose part of the question was about that, if you like, the normality of ASN within the system. I think there's probably a few parts to that, and part of it was alluded to in the presentation about where we are better at recognising and diagnosing and assessing young people in terms of an additional support need that they might have. So that's definitely improved, and that's been part of the work that the team has done over the last 2 to 3 years, but it's replicated nationally as well. Part of it is some increase that's happening out there, and I think the team pointed out, for example, in terms of developmental milestones of children coming into primary one, and speaking to colleagues nationally, that's a picture that they see. So there are
more young people coming into primary one, particularly in terms of speech and social developmental milestones who are not quite hitting the mark. So we're having to do something different in primary one, and again, that was your enhanced primary one offer that we spoke about. I think the figures round about ASN are interesting, aren't they? I think what was really important in the presentation was to look at those some of those individual ASNs which can be met at a classroom level, either through universal practice or through minor adjustments. So depending on, for example, the intensity of a dyslexic type difficulty, if you talked about some of the adjustments a classroom teacher would make and it'd be expected to make, and back in 2012 when I was a classroom teacher, that's what I would be doing as well. So, as an example, individual schools, some of them get quite high ASN figures. So one of the schools that jumps to my mind has an recorded ASN at 60%, but those are not all complex ASNs, and only 20%, it's still a substantial number, require a children or young person's plan. So that's the other part of context round about all this. I think that what the team have done over the last couple of years in terms of the staged intervention framework has been to look to address the need, in the least intrusive way at the best possible level. And I think probably your last comment about, are we in danger of missing out on the 33% without that? So one of our key improvement priorities this year is improving learning, teaching and assessment. And I think that we've become far better, not just in PKC, but far better across Scotland and globally in the last 10 years at, meeting the needs of all learners in the classroom. So, if I go into a secondary classroom, because that's my bag, and I see a teacher droning away at the front with a PowerPoint to 30 pupils, I'm asking a question about whether they're stretching the more able, because let's not forget that part of it as well as meeting the needs of everybody in the class. So the foundations of that are really good learning and teaching in terms of that universal need and the additional need as well. But happy to go further than that if that's if you're looking for more detail.
My final point was on another of I think it was the final slide, don't need to see it, but it talked about reducing staff absence. And I'm just wondering if these levels of ASN are having an effect on our teaching staff, their understanding of what the job was when they came into it and their capability to deal with it. And how is this driving staff and the ability to employ staff away?
So I think that, what the team have clearly kind of been able to tease out is that the nature of the job has changed. So since I became a teacher in 1994, the children and young people that you're seeing in front of you, there is a change, and there's probably a societal change as well that we're all part of. And I think that, as I said in my last answer, that is something about our leadership of change, and it's also about how we meet needs in the classroom and how we meet all those needs in the classroom. So it's part of how you deliver your learning and teaching and your skill as a practitioner. That's difficult because you are seeing more complexity of needs, and the team have been really clear about what's coming through primary one and the way that the kind of growth in that, potentially a threefold growth in terms of enhanced need. And that might only be 35 children across Perth and Kinross, but these children have, complex needs that require partnership working and some very specific inputs. So that's the kind of background that we're facing. So it does require, a change in terms of the teaching profession. Again, talking to colleagues across Scotland, that's something that the system's grappling with. And, you'll see a lot of noise about that. I think, though, to be clear, in terms of our own position in Perth and Kinross and teacher absence, that's something that we've been working on for a good number of years. I think probably, looking back at the data, as far back as 2010, looking at the local government benchmarking framework, we've been trying to really get to grips with improving teacher attendance at work. We've got a really well developed health and wellbeing framework for teachers, and fun enough, we've got a head teacher day next Tuesday, and that's a big part of the input, which is about the fact that it's a complex, difficult and demanding job. It always was, and it's growingly so. It's a well-rewarded and professional job as well, and that's why the team, the central team, do a really crucial job, I think, in providing the supports for people out there So that's a long answer. The short answer is it's difficult. It is changing, and we need to adapt to that, and we need to support teachers in classrooms to adapt to that as we move ahead.
Just on that, and great, thank you for the answers, comprehensive, well done. Teacher training at university, are we giving them heavy training on ASN requirement?
I would say there's scope for improvement there, and that's something that colleagues, my colleagues and ADES, the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, are having a bit of a dialogue in part of the ecosystem.
Great, thank you both. Councillor Forbes next.
Thanks. Councillor Allen took one of my questions, but I'll move on to my second one. It was one of the earlier slides when Susie was presenting, and it showed the graph where ASN in Scotland was kind of below Perth and Kinross, but was just catching up. And Susie said something that was about ASN reporting and budget. I didn't quite catch it, but what's concerning me is that is there money available from the Scottish Government based on the number of children with ASN, and would there therefore be a desire to push that number up to meet budget? I'm hoping I've completely misinterpreted that.
No, is the answer. So is the short answer. I think what Susie was alluding to was, you know, in the previous allocation of staffing, the way that staffing was allocated, and you know, if you're going to be able to talk a wee bit more about, you know, the way we allocate staffing now, but under the previous staffing, there was a bit of an incentive in schools to record every ASN that you had to make sure that you then got an extra allocation of staffing to make that ASN. Now, you know, that provided potentially a bit of a perverse incentive in terms of that recording of need. We allocate our staffing in a completely different way now, and I think that might explain why our graph's a little bit flatter than it has been in Scotland. I don't think it necessarily means that our growth has been any different from that which has been in Scotland, and looking at colleagues, they're nodding as well. So I think that's been part of our asset allocation and recording process that's really led to that more than anything that sets us apart from the rest of the country.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Robertson next.
Thank you, Vice Convener. I'm going to ask a question. I like my colleagues have found this a very interesting and sobering experience to visit schools. But the school I visited, we asked the head teacher if there was anything with regard to the design of the school that she would change. And she said the fact that it was a modern school with open plan classrooms made it very, very difficult, given the number of children they had in the school that had behavioural difficulties. So I was really surprised that we're actually building schools that I've visited, Crieff Primary, for example, and that's open plan, Kinross is open plan, that make it difficult for teachers to actually, and the pupils themselves, within the classroom, because there's loads and loads of distractions, because people are going backwards and forwards all the time along the corridors. So can you say a wee bit about that and how we've got to a situation where teachers are finding it difficult due to the way we've designed the classrooms? Thank you.
So one of our ASN transformation work streams is round about learning environments. So I'm probably going to pass over to Fiona to give you a good detailed answer on that.
I would agree with you in terms, and I think many of my colleagues would agree that there are challenges with some of our learning environments, and it is something that we're working towards changing. At a structural level, we are, in terms of new build schools now, have doors. So Riverside Primary School, which is our most recent school to be built, it was designed learning the lessons from that. The design for the new school at Bertha Park, primary school at Bertha Park, issued that, or when that comes on board, will also be of a similar design to Riverside. So I think that it's to give assurance in terms of that's there, but we also do have these schools where there are currently that those challenges, and we're working with our property colleagues as part of the ASN transformation programme to look at how we could perhaps mitigate that. We can't change it because there are restrictions in terms of the design of buildings, flow of air, heating, all of these things, ventilation, that mean that there's a lot of dependencies in terms of that. So there's not a quick fix. You know, anybody that going into the school would say, can we not just build a wall there? But unfortunately, you know, we've all said that and been told really no. So but it is something that is very much at the heart of what we're doing, because it's not just about the new schools that are coming on board. It is about supporting our staff and our children and young people within existing schools to make the most of that and to adapt the rooms where they possibly can.
Thank you for the question and the answer there, Councillor Stewart. Sorry, convener even.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Thanks for the introduction, Mr. McCluskey. I think it's your first time, so welcome. And thanks for the presentation, Ms. Turner and Ms. Mackay. Ms. Turner, you started out with a description of the sort of statutory underpinning in terms of a right to mainstreaming, but that then kind of morphed in terms of the guidance into an assumption that there would be mainstreaming except in the exceptional cases, or you know, the very elevated cases. And then Ms. Turner was talking about the paper that's coming to Learning and Families Committee this afternoon, which is seeking to provide more intensive support provision hubs, I think, in schools. Listening to parents as recently as yesterday, I got the impression that they were less concerned about whether there was mainstreaming, but whether the provision for their child was correct. So I just wondered whether, in terms of that right to mainstreaming, there's also a right to non-mainstreaming, if you like, and whether the interpretation of that bit of guidance is leading us down a path which is not appropriate for some children.
Yeah, thank you. So the presumption of mainstreaming exists and still exists and hasn't been amended. So that is our starting point, that people, that children and young people with additional support needs have a right to be considered for their local mainstream school. It is also the case, of course, and it is within that legislation that there will be specialist education for those with an exceptional level of need. And I think what we've seen in some of the recent inquiries is that with the rise in need, and particularly the rise in complex needs, each of the reviews has said local authorities do need to, while continuing with the presumption of mainstreaming, also look at the availability of local specialist education, which we have within our intensive support provisions. So in terms of the backdrop and where we are with the legislation, I hope that gives a bit more clarity. Fiona?
If I could just add to that as well, because I think it also crosses over into the bit around parental confidence. Because if our supports within our mainstream schools are not sufficient and not able to accommodate the particular needs of our children and young people with the more complex, at the more complex end of that, then we will have more placing requests, because parents do have the right in statute to make a placing request for any of our provisions, and that is always supported and managed, and we have seen a particular rise in terms of the number of placing requests that we've seen over recent times as the complexity of need has changed. But the work that we're doing very much through the ASN transformation, although we have the paper coming forward, and one of our first concrete, if you like, actions of the ASN transformation is to focus in on the the expansion of intensive support provisions, the other work that sits behind that hasn't required that to come forward as such a concrete change is about enhancing the support that we can provide within our schools, so that we can work with our parents to be able to ensure that they feel supported and that their child's needs are being met and that they're able to access their education, because the key part of it is that those children are able to access their education in the setting that they're in. Otherwise they're not learning. The SWAY that I talked about, the document I talked about embedding it in the presentation, very much is aimed at helping parents to develop that competence as well, so they can get a concrete understanding about what schools are like now. Because I think one of the big challenges with the changing times, if you like, is that people's point of reference are often when they were in school themselves, and that our system has moved on significantly since then, whereas many of our children that are currently in our schools would not have been able to be accommodated at that time. They would have had to be in specialist provision. They are now able to be part and parcel of their school community.
Thanks. Another question is about that very sort of stark figure of the 7,000 children and young people with additional support needs, which has increased by 2,000 from, I think it was 2013. I know that we've covered this sort of previously offline, but I just wanted to sort of maybe sort of put it on the record that although that's a very large figure, within that, for example, there's also a maybe, if I recall correctly, sort of quarter or a fifth of it, which is English as an additional language, which would be for a defined period of time. So until people become proficient, and then it's not an additional support need. Or bereavement, I think, was the other example, that was a sort of temporary additional support need rather than a permanent one. But I just wondered, I wondered whether we'd been able to do any breakdown of the sort of durations of each additional support need, because if something's a temporary problem, it's less of a requirement for elected members in terms of providing budgetary capacity to deal with.
Our systems people are continuing to kind of battle with that one. We have been able to break it down, as we showed in the presentation, where there's only, you know, for those bigger groups of additional support needs that are identified, like English as an additional language, we were able to break it down to see where that was the only requirement, because that indicates that bit around it being for a particular time period and moving forward and progressing. But at this point in time, we haven't been able to work out a way to track the actual lengths of recording for each. And I would say as well that with our changed child's plan paperwork and recording that will come from that will allow us to make that be able to see that more easily, but that is a 3-year implementation period, and we have only just started that, so it'll take us a wee bit of time to get through that.
Thank you. And maybe just a sort of quick follow-up comment. I think it would be instructive for members. We've seen the change over time, and we've seen the breakdown of each condition. It might be instructive as well to see the change in each broken down additional support need from the 2000. So, you know, whether there are much shallower gradients for some of the additional support needs and steeper increases for some of the other ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Shires, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Just to echo the comments about how useful this has been, it has been really not there haven't been many surprises in the process, I don't think, but the scale of the situation being faced across schools has been quite what word would be sobering, I think was the one that colleagues have used. My question is kind of on our homework out of all of this. So we've seen the areas of improvement, and we know there's a transformation programme in place, and thank you to Jacqueline for all her support in all of this, because she's been fantastic. And we can only deliver so much with what we've got, and whether there be capital or revenue budgetary input. And it's really that other places the Scottish Government are going to have to really recognise the scale of this, and it was to have an understanding of discussions at COSLA, your head teachers, forums, national bodies, because in discussion with you, David, we know we're not the only local authority facing the scale of this. I think we were probably one of the, as some of Susie's figures, I remember back when first elected, an understanding that people were moving to Perth and Kinross to access resource that was available here that wasn't available in other places, and early challenges that schools and certainly communities started to face from that, which we're still seeing, I think, in those areas even now. So yeah, so just get an understanding of where you see this going and where we might, or our colleagues in future, in 5 years, if a Scrutiny and Performance Committee were to come back and look at this, in 10 years, if that committee was to come back and look at this, where we would hope to be, because we've had 3 national reviews since 2020. We're conducting our own review, and you don't want these documents just to sit on a shelf. They need to be constantly moving forward. If that's a question, there's quite a lot to that, as you know. For me, that's just the stream of consciousness that comes out. But yeah, if you can answer that, David.
Thanks, Councillor Shires. Yeah, so it is a big question, isn't it? I think when you're looking at inclusion in ASN, for me, you really have to look at it in the round. And I think there's a danger if you focus, as we will be this afternoon, focus solely on the intensive end of that provision. There's a danger of sticking plaster, and there's that danger of consistently escalating need. So that, we have learned lessons from other local authorities who have really focused there, but only there. And what's happened is they've become overwhelmed, because that point that Fiona made about, us delivering a high quality education and parents really having confidence in that and the ability to meet that in a classroom, they probably neglected slightly. So they ended up in a place where they were never then getting upstream really of this kind of growing need. So the direction to go in, I think, is what does the round look like? And we talked a lot today about universal and additional and enhanced and then intensive provision. So what are the things that are going to make the difference at every part in that story? We talked a bit about how the classroom looks now and what will be different from the classroom of 10, 20 years ago. Many of us are in here are of an age and stage. I could say that when I went to school, I didn't see so many additional support needs because my class was streamed. I never saw those young people. We're in a different world now entirely. And, so there's that bit about how we meet that in the round. There's a bit about our improvement priorities as well as a local authority. It's not for nothing that we've got 3 improvement priorities this year of improving learning, teaching and assessment, improving the leadership of change in our schools, and the transformation of ASN. So they don't exist in isolation, and those first 2 priorities will build towards that inclusion, that ability that we have to meet the inclusive picture as well. So there's that bit about the round, and then there's that bit about the present and the need at the moment, and where we are necessarily being reactive to some of the issues that we're facing. So part of it is about that workforce development that we touched on earlier on, about our own career-long professional learning pathways. We think we've good and well-developed pathways here in Perth and Kinross, but we're continuing to evolve and develop them, particularly in terms of meeting additional support needs. I think that what's been helpful, but of course it's not the whole answer, is it? But it's been helpful the Scottish Government have allocated 28 million, particularly towards additional support needs, and we'll have a share of that. And we'll need to think how best to spend that wisely. It probably won't be reinvention. It'll be about enhancement of the approaches that we're already developing and taking. I think that, the inclusion team have come today and they are so expert in their field, but it's not just the inclusion team, it's other officers, it's every teacher, it's every head teacher that need to bring that to the party. And I think, as Susie said, there's a societal part to that as well. And I think that's why the engagement, as Fiona said, with this committee has been really beneficial to the team, because we genuinely have gained some new understanding through the process. So that's been really, really positive. So it's been a wide answer to the question, Councillor Shires. But I suppose if I was going to sum it up in Pressy at the end, it would be, dealing I don't want to say dealing with the issue of inclusion, delivering the best possible education for every child and young person in Scotland and indeed here in Perth and Kinross is everybody's business. But there are particular places that we need to pay attention to make sure that we're doing that. And as I say, one of them that's kind of most present is in the way we're looking at intensive support. Of course, it is an authority, but we're also seeing that tripling of the enhanced support for those new primary ones that we're seeing. Nationally, there's something about developmental milestones as well, and that's something about working with health colleagues and other partners. And I think that partnership bit is key, because once we start looking at children and young people with particularly enhanced needs or greater, you know, education alone will struggle to really meet the needs that we want to. So that's another area for us to really kind of bottom out, I think. So none of it easy, all of it complex, all of it challenging, but what greater mission could there be?
Can I come back in on one point? So from the format of the report and recommendations that we might bring forward, is it within our gift to say we'd like to, you know, recognising that there's a review of transformation process ongoing, that there would then be built in for the future? You know, I'm just kind of thinking about colleagues in the future, knowing that this piece of work was carried out. Is there the opportunity to build that in for a future review of the review? Just so it doesn't end up, so it does become a kind of, with, you know, a living document, but it becomes something that is built into the challenge and review that we as a council undertake of this particular, recognising the importance of it, area of council business.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good proposal, and it's something we could maybe consider at the next meeting, that one of our recommendations might be, or it might only be advisory because we can't tie the hands of a future council. We might recommend that the future scrutiny committee or its successor committee looks again at this in the year 2020, whatever. I think that might be reasonable to make sure that it's on a 5-yearly cycle, to make sure that these good intentions turn into practice. That's great. Okay, moving to Councillor Welch then with a question. Thanks.
Thank you, Vice Convener. Like other members of this committee have mentioned, that I found it hugely insightful, and I think the word sombering was used in terms of the commitment by staff and teams within the council to deliver a, you know, a high standard of education, you know, right across the school piece, specifically to ensure that those with additional supported needs, you know, could achieve their best potential. I guess, I think you mentioned it yourself, historically, you know, classes were streamed, and maybe some of the challenge from a teaching resource perspective, and ultimately some of the potential understandable disruption in classes, you know, was maybe not, you know, as impactful for some pupils in the past. In terms of obviously, we heard from principally sort of staff members. Do you also get feedback from the pupil community across, you know, the schools in terms of how they feel their own education is going? And that's across all groups, you know, whether it's supported needs or otherwise, just to ensure that they feel that, you know, the environment they need for their learning is equally as good as it can be. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So through the introduction of UNCRC and a long time before that, the enhancement of pupil voice within our schools has been probably one of the big really improvements and real growth areas over the last 10 years, and it's been used really positively. And I think, you know, engagement with social media, and you'll see lots of fantastic examples of that, you know. And I think that thing of pupil voice is really important. So I was in chamber once before, and Susie was talking to head teachers. She said, you know, don't conflate pupil voice with pupil choice, because it's about pupil voice within the framework of education and their own experience. I think that's really important to kind of be aware of. I think schools have done a good job in that. I think there's probably a piece for us to do as a team to collate and gather that information in a more structured way to inform. And as you say, that's not just about inclusion, that's about the entirety of the educational experience. So I know that is, and we obviously have a youth strategy as well, that we're part of and we contribute to. But I think that those individual pieces that go on could be better harnessed in the whole to gather that voice. So I would absolutely take that point on as an improvement action, and it's something we'd already been talking about.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Massey next, please.
Thank you, Vice Convener. So my machine just decided to log me out. So I'm looking at something that's supposed to be there, but it's not. Can you go on to the next question if there's another one?
Yep, so surprised Councillor Smith is you up right away.
Thank you very much, Vice Convener. I'm actually just looking for some sort of assurances here. I'm obviously worried about the high number of people with the assisted needs. There is a societal change, there's no question about that. The media has been very strong on the behaviour of pupils in school. And what I'm looking for is answers to say that, for instance, if we have a young and experienced teacher coming in, and I know I did, we all misbehaved in school. I just want not these situations to be classed as assisted needed, because there's no question we can twist the teacher sometimes around your wee finger. So I'd like to know who assesses that and to make sure that it's not included in the total figure. Is that possible? Thank you.
So I was really well behaved at school. I don't think I ever got into trouble. Reflecting back, although I'm old enough, I did get the belt once, but it wasn't my fault. So just the once, yeah, mistaken identity. But yeah, I think there's a serious point to be made there, and I am going to disentangle it, because I think that's really essentially what you're asking for. And the one is that question round about classroom management, pupil behaviour, opportunities that children will take to remove their attention from their lesson to something more mischievous. And I think there's for example, we are currently working in guidance round about mobile phone usage in school, which is a kind of change in the landscape, and we'll be bringing that to Learning and Families Committee. So that's to kind of support the behaviour aspect in school in its kind of wider sense. You mentioned about younger and inexperienced teachers. I think that's a really good point. We have a really, really good probationary induction scheme. So everybody that comes to Perth and Ross is mentored in school, has a key point of contact within the central team, come here to this chamber usually for lots of input, and a lot of that is about that classroom management, classroom behaviour. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing about that misbehaviour piece in school is, let's be honest, a lot of it happens if the learning's not engaging, if it's not stretching, if it's far removed. So that quality of learning, teaching and assessment, and I'm aware I'm going on like a bit of a broken record, if we can improve that, then behaviour will improve as well. And I think there's a bit about sharing experience within schools. So we actually have quite a number of professional forums for the teachers themselves to share their own experience. So you're absolutely right. There is that bit about misbehaviour in schools, and we have to be really, really clear that we don't conflate that with an additional support need, and that the diagnoses round about those are clear for us. So I have confidence that we're clear in when we're meeting those two different parts of the world. And I think the other thing that I would say, the people with greater expertise behind you that could maybe add a bit more here. But often when we do see young people with an ASN, which is around about social, emotional and behavioural needs, that phrase that Susie used called comorbidity exists, and it exists alongside other factors of disadvantage or another ASN as well. So that helps give us a bit of clarity in terms of our assessment round about that child and young person. But I would want to give you an assurance that we do, our schools have values. We do uphold those values. Every school has a relationships policy, and part of that will improve a necessary kind of outcome or sanction for young people who are not actually following that, and that will be really dependent upon what happens and also the profile of the young person. So I hope that's answered your question, Councillor Smith.
It has, thank you. You must have been well behaved at school.
Okay, thank you. And then question to Councillor Massey.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Apologies. I'm looking at section 9.2, where it says a significant number of children and young people with ASN are supported at stage 1 of the stage intervention framework and are provided with universal support by their classroom teacher. Of the 6,973 children and young people recorded to have an ASN, 4,054, 58.1% are recorded on CMIS to have child young persons plan established, indicating the remaining children and young people are supported through planning at class level. Now, I have had a look at the stage intervention plan, and at stage 1 it says that it's identified support needs that are provided for by the class subject teacher. It goes on, I'm sure you're very aware of it. That's 2,900 children that are being identified at stage 1 and having support from the teacher or assistance. Why is the number of children with ASN remaining or actually increasing when these 2,900 children, I'm assuming that it's for reading or writing or something like that, they drop off the list? Is that correct, or am I reading this totally and utterly wrong?
So our children and young people who are supported at class level will continue to remain within the ASN data overall. So although they're supported at a classroom level, it's important that their additional support needs are still recorded, and therefore they'll be counted within the figures. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Does that answer the question? Or
Not really. What it says that in stage level 1, that it can be something like changing the physical environment. Now, the physical environment of just moving around the classroom, moving furniture around the classroom so that it helps the child. Then, if the child's being helped, does that still mean that they've got an additional support need? Although you've you've helped that child. Basically what I'm asking is, when does a child not need additional support? When do they come off the list or the total number?
sorry, Councillor Massey, I understand now. No, the children would not come off the recording of additional support needs if their adjustments are in place, and that is helping them to be able to access their education, overcome the barrier would be how we would put it. So with those adjustments put in place, their barrier to learning is overcome. But if that was to ever that adjustment was to disappear again, then we would see an escalation and probably in terms of their presentation. So it's really important that we keep them recorded as having an additional support need, so that people are looking to see, well, what are the adjustments that we need to be making on an ongoing, continuous basis. So where it would change and where a young person's needs would change. So if they are recorded as being autistic, that will not change. So the things that will change are things like the impact of family issues or bereavement, and therefore it would be up to the class teacher and whoever else in the school has responsibility to be reviewing whether anything different, any adjustment is needing to continue to be applied after a particular period. So that might be reviewed after a month, it might be reviewed after 6 months, depending on what that was. But the responsibility around that review of whether or not they're required to continue to be recorded as having an additional support need would be taken by the people that are closest to them and in conjunction with discussion with their parent.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. There being no further questions then, unless there's, so no further questions, what I'll do is hand over to comments, and Councillor Aaron, you were super quick, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Vice Convener, and thank you to the whole team for coming in today and presenting and sharing, and what a frustrating time it must be for you all. I have this from two complete extremes. I went to school a long time ago, and I did get the belt, and I deserved it every time. And I think that kind of corrected me, and I am where I am. It's up to people to decide whether that's right or wrong, but I feel that the discipline in schools many years ago was fine. However, through a business colleague, I'm also aware of a young lad, a 7-year-old in North Lanarkshire, who was totally excluded and not well looked after until he got a new support teacher. And that support teacher gradually engaged and got him back into a school environment, into a class environment. At the outset, he was quite tearful and had no friends. Now he's a popular community within that school. And I think that what we're doing here is fabulous. It's heartless. It takes such amount of time and a lot of frustration. And all I'm going to do is just say, I wish you all well. Good luck.
Cool. Thank you, Councillor Allen. Any further comments? Okay, I'll close this item then by obviously adding my sincere thanks to David and Fiona and all the team who have been supporting us. Many of us councillors have professional lives, and I'm not sure we'd be as welcoming of a group of councillors poking around in all our homework. So thank you very much for your openness and transparency as we poked around in your homework. And that's very heartfelt, so thank you very much. So we are asked to note the national reviews, note the legislation, note the data and information on current ASN provision, consider the PKC policy approach, and I think most importantly for me, that committee, so we as elected members, will bring its own finding to the next meeting for debate. So I very much look forward to that, and thank you elected members for being part of those reviews, for visiting the schools, for attending the meetings with other charities. And we look forward to bringing forward our own report in the April meeting. So do committee agree that we have agree with the recommendation of the report? Great. Thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you, members. We have been going for 2¼ hours, and normally at this point I would call a recess. We don't have an awful lot on the agenda, but we do have some officer turnover, so we'll just have a 5-minute recess. Okay, thank you, members. The next item on the agenda is the review of Perth and Kinross Council support to community-led physical asset development and regeneration of key buildings. This was the item that I referred to in the outstanding business statement, where in the minute of the prior meeting we were talking about doing a review into the arising from the situation with the Drummond Arms Hotel in Crieff. We have along to introduce this report Serge Moreau, who is our strategic lead for economy development and planning, and I think Steve MacDonald. Is this your first meeting, Steve?
It's my first performance and scrutiny meeting.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Your first scrutiny and performance meeting. Steve MacDonald is the Economic Development Manager for Business, Place and Investment, so welcome to you. And I'll just hand over to you directly.
Thanks, convener. Good morning, just about, I think, morning, councillors. So it was requested at the Finance and Resources Committee in November that a review of Perth and Kinross Council support to community-led physical asset development is carried out. The purpose of this report is to confirm the agreed scope of this review. So the key areas to be included are previous examples of community-led development. This will link into the work of the Vacant and Eyesore Property Group. The reasons for intervention, the assessment process, the council's financial support and monitoring processes, and lessons learned and best practice. So if approved, the report presenting the findings of the review will be presented to the next scrutiny and performance meeting on the 23rd of April. Happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Question, Vice Convener.
It's a question and maybe also a comment. I suppose if I phrase it as a question, I wonder whether elected members and officers might support us in expanding the scope a little here. And the reason for this is that I think with these kinds of projects, there's a need to also look into the points at which and the questions at which, the decision points at which elected members and committee approvals are sought on such projects. Because I've observed that sometimes these things only come to committee, often finance and resources or SPNR before it, at a point when the community already has an expectation and a pounds and pence amount in mind. And at that point, it makes it very hard for any member, particularly ward members who are naturally closest to these community groups and closest to these buildings, to really scrutinise those, lest they be branded as a naysayer. So I'm wondering whether we could look into maybe include the scope here, the idea of reviewing what the best point is to seek elected member input, in order that we don't have this situation where the sort of the bag of sweeties, if we will, becomes so tempting it's impossible for any elected member, let alone a ward member, to say, no, actually, I have some concerns maybe about the suitability of this building or the capacity of this given group. So I wonder if that would be something we could add into the scope. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy, but your question, I think we could add a bullet point on elected member engagement in the process. Not an issue with that.
Okay, and I think actually if we look at the key areas to be included, I understand entirely the point you're making, Vice Convener, but I think if we look at the sort of key areas to be included, the second and third last bullet points are about the assessment process and the council's financial support and related monitoring processes. Perhaps that covers what you're talking about and what you're actually looking for as a recommendation in the final report related to elected member engagement. But a good point, well made. Councillor Shars.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with Billy's points on that as well. My question was whether there was going to be under the best practice, would be looking at examples from other local authorities where similar situations have been dealt with.
Yeah, I think that's something we could definitely include. I know one personal experience working in other local authorities, there's examples that I could personally draw on, but I think, you know, even at a kind of regional basis, we could, you know, through the regional maybe economic partnership that we have, we could potentially look at that as well. So I think, you know, that's a good idea and something we could include within the scope as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And Councillor Forbes.
Following on from a similar pattern to Billy's point, occurs to me that occasionally when these things go wrong, we look at the makeup and the structure of the group, and perhaps some of the issues are within that. And I wonder if it would be sensible to have a kind of, just thinking off the top of my head here, but a kind of criteria of how the group should be structured, how it should be financed, the kind of people that are involved in it perhaps. I don't really know what I'm asking for, but I wonder if it's something we should be asking officers to go and look at and come back with some recommendations on.
I would imagine that for the members of the committee, before the officers bring back this report to the next meeting, we will be having sort of discussions on the content of the report. So maybe if you want to flesh that out a little bit more, my initial reaction would be that it would not necessarily be appropriate for the council to be dictating to community groups what their structure or anything should be. But again, if there were systematically some ways of structuring community groups that worked and some ways that didn't, then it could certainly be a strong recommendation during the consideration of any individual project. But maybe if we take that during the actual preparation process, and we'll flesh that idea out a little bit more, if that sounds okay. Thank you. Councillor Vice Convener, second question.
A quick question really triggered by something mentioned just there. I noticed the next step is that the findings and the review will be presented at the next meeting, which is only the Wednesday after Easter. That feels awfully close. Are we confident we can achieve that timeline, or should we give ourselves a little more time just to be sure we can do a thorough job here? Thank you.
I mean, you're right, it's tight. I think what we could do is to, if the scope is agreed, we could look at the time scale and take into account all the comments to see if the 23rd of April is realistic, and maybe come back in terms of with the convener to see if it's more appropriate to take it to the following meeting.
And Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Convener. Just to understand, is this specifically sort of council physical assets, or is it sort of wider physical assets that communities might be interested in dealing with? Because there's obviously a PKC asset review underway. It's just to understand, if that's what the extent of that is. Thank you.
I think it's primarily where there's been council support, that would be what this review was about. Otherwise, I think the scope could be too wide in terms of other projects. Control's probably the wrong word, but we wouldn't have a direct involvement in that. So I think for this piece of work, from my point of view, it'd be best just to keep it where we've kind of supported financially or with officer time.
Thanks. So just to clarify, it's not necessarily that the organisation might be in a PKC physical asset building, but effectively we're working with them to identify a structure that they might then best look to move to in some form of asset transfer type arrangement. Okay, but it is just to note that there also is a PKC asset review, and some of the communities that you're talking about actually are in PKC assets at the moment, and in terms of asset transfer, etc., that's obviously, this should feed into that element too.
Yeah, we don't want to duplicate any work, so as part of this review, we'll certainly identify other pieces of work that are relevant, and we won't duplicate, and we'll make sure that they kind of complement each other wherever necessary.
Okay, I'm not seeing any further questions. Happy to open up this comments. Councillor Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. I certainly welcome this report. I think it's one that we're really needing to have a good look at. We can't allow council money to be spent on projects which are just not viable, and it can cause a great deal of stress, not just to the people involved in the project itself, but also to the greater communities that involves. I know of a potential asset transfer in my ward, which is the community are looking at, and I think they're having a great many sleepless nights wondering how it's going to stack up. So I think it's important that we make sure that things are financially sound and that the project has a good possibility of going ahead and being successful before we spend large amounts of money on it.
Thanks. I think that's key to the whole initiation of the review, and it's not just about spending large amounts of money on a project. It's about the council, as in the case of the Drummond Arms, being left on the hook for up to £3 million worth of costs, with no demonstrable benefit to the council taxpayers and residents of Perth and Kinross. I'm not seeing any other comments then, so can we, as a committee, confirm the agreed scope of the review with the noted 2 additions regarding elected member engagement and comparison with other local authorities for best practice, and request that officers bring back a report to Scrutiny and Performance Committee meeting in April 2025, or possibly after, following discussion. Thank you very much. That takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the sorry, thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. That takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, the Perth and Kinross Health and Social Care Partnership Clinical and Care Governance Exception Report. There are, over the period since we last looked at the report, no new or emerging significant risks which have been identified since the last reporting period. So I don't propose that we need to take any questions on this. If anybody has any, then we'll certainly accept them in writing, but noting that this is the sort of interim short 2-page report as opposed to the full report, and we'll be getting the full report at the next committee, if that's okay. Great. Okay, that then draws business for today to a close. Thank you very much to all members for your attendance and engagement, and particularly to all the officers and the staff of Teesside Contracts who've come along and given us the reports and recommendations and answered questions. Thank you very much. The meeting is closed.